Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is David Eggins. I work for a very small charity, Temper Domestic Violence, and this is the first of 3 clips which focuses on the work of domestic abuser perpetrator programs, so-called DAPPs. And in the current circumstances, those are advocated very strongly by Cafcass. And what I'm going to try to point out to you here is some of the difficulties. Over the course of these 3 clips, I'm going to try to point out some of the difficulties that exist with this particular type of program. If I remember correctly, it was in about the 1970s that the Japanese companies began to start building cars in the United Kingdom, or to import them in considerable numbers. They started with a concerted advertising effort which went something like this: "Our cars don't half work." Now, the beauty of that very neat expression in English is, of course, that they exaggerated the fact of their cars working, but the flip side of it also pointed out that the English cars were really not quite so good, because in fact they didn't half work. That means that probably half the cars just weren't functioning properly at all, okay, or that all the cars were more or less only half functioning. So on the positive side, the Japanese advertising campaign promoted the Japanese products, and on the negative side, it gave the English motor manufacturers really quite a sound kicking. And from what I can remember of British Leyland, or it might have been called Leyland at that time, it was a reputation which was particularly well deserved. And I've got personal experience of having a Austin Allegro, I think it was. One of the other things, of course, was that when they changed the name from British Leyland to Leyland, they were effectively removing the bad reputation which had been achieved by British Leyland from the brand British, which would have been very necessary for all of the other manufacturing industries. So when we now come to domestic abuse perpetrator programs, so-called DAPPs, if I said to you these courses don't half work, then you might well reasonably believe, as the Japanese did in the early days, that that was a really good marketing strategy. But of course the flip side of it is that in fact these courses don't half work. In fact, actually it's worse than that, because they don't even half work, they don't even 1/3 work. And on a Freedom of Information request which I put to Cafcass that forwarded 909 men to DAPPs in the last full year before the lockdown, they couldn't tell me or tell anybody how many men completed those DAPPs. But when I approached them with a Freedom of Information request and asked them how many of the men got a midway report, the response came back in numbers which can be transferred into a percentage, which was that less than 33% of the men got a midway report. So what we can really say is then that less than 1/3 of the men forwarded at a cost of £1.2 million to Cafcass actually got to the end of the programme. And in fact the figures are probably much worse than that, because evidence from previous information which I have on the workings of these programmes suggests that less than 1/4 of the men actually make it through the programme. Now, all of that would potentially cast Cafcass in a very bad light, just as it would cast British Leyland in a very bad light and require a name change. Unfortunately, Cafcass, the Child and Family Court Advisory and Support Service, can't really easily change its name. But it translates into an even worse light for families and for children. Okay, Cafcass, the Child and the Children and Family Court Advisory Service, because vast numbers of mainly men get separated from their children. And the system works like this. The woman wants to separate for whatever reasons. She's quickly informed that If she accuses the man of violent or abusive behaviours, she will be awarded legal aid. The case goes eventually into a family court where the man is accused of a number of abuses of his female partner. Legal aid supports her in her claims, providing a solicitor, etc. And the claims then become vested in domestic violence against the man. And the allegations are made and taken to court, and usually there are 6 of them, 6 allegations which are made. And on the balance of probability, the judge or the magistrate, advised by Cafcass, will find or not find the accusations made. So, when the accusations are made, the man is treated in many respects as if he were a criminal and had been tried in the criminal court and had been found guilty beyond all reasonable doubt. If he accepts the court's findings, then he's eligible to be put on to a DAPP, a domestic abuse perpetrator program, funded by Cafcass. Now let's say of the 6 allegations, he recognises that 4 of them are really justified and legitimate. And there might be 2 of them which, for whatever reason, he finds are not justified or legitimate. And those might be purely about his perceptions of what violent or abusive behaviour is, or they might also have been constructions by the female partner who was busy ramping up the case to try to ensure that the outcomes would be in her favour, as she might well have been advised to do by her supporting solicitor. So if the man doesn't accept all of the findings made by the courts, then he's not eligible for one of the DAPPs. And when he's not eligible for one of the DAPPs, then really he's kind of cast into oblivion, or at least as far as his children are considered, he's cast into oblivion. Now, of course, once he recognises that he's not going to be able to do anything to get closer contact with his children, he then thinks to himself, okay, well maybe what I need to do is to just accept that I did what the court said I did, or what she alleged that I did, and what the court agreed that I'd obviously done. Maybe I'd better just go along with that and say, okay, I did that. Of course, under those circumstances, then Cafcass will turn and say, well, in the initial phases of the court process, you didn't agree to that, and therefore you obviously lied at that time. Now, one can have some understanding of that, but of course people do gradually understand from processes that they have been they've put themselves in the wrong position. And for example, up until 2003, before it became legally a legal requirement that sex within marriage had to be consensual, rather than, as it had been up until 2003, largely an agreement between the couple at the time when they married that they would have sex whenever one or the other of them liked the idea of that. So all of that changed in 2003, and obviously there are also now a number of other cultures where that still hasn't filtered in, and people that come into the country from other countries or from other cultures don't know of the existence of that, and so they might very reasonably be accused and found guilty of rape within the British court system. However, ignorance is no defence under the law, but where on earth would these people have learnt that? There's no education programme to advise them of the differences in the legal situation in Britain, and also in the ways in which culturally we are expected now to bring up our children in Britain. Anyway, on the face of all of that then, Cafcass then refuses the individual a place on a DAPP. It leaves the individual with nowhere to go, and the reason that Cafcass does refuse is because the providers of the DAPP, all of whom have had to have been accredited by an organisation called Respect or by the probation service, that there's then nowhere for them to go, nothing very much for them to do in terms of having future contact with their children. Now, on the other side of that, of course, the woman that made the accusations, if those were not found against the man, then presumably we could construe that the woman had been lying. However, there are no circumstances in which she is held to account for those misrepresentations, as the court has found. So where does all of this leave us? Well, effectively, the man becomes stopped from having contact with his children, or has the most minimal of contact through to his children. And much more important, his children have very, very much reduced contact with him. And the significance of that can only be seen in future generations. One of the other problems with this is that, of course, a man that's been abusive to his partner is then denied any treatment which might help to correct those behaviours for a future relationship, and almost inevitably then he will go on, perhaps having learnt from the experiences in the family court, and perhaps having been wised up about the whole situation, that he goes on into the next relationship, and the next relationship is also likely to have aspects of the same behaviours which went on before. In the worst case which we have come across in the 25 years in which we've been working with domestic abusers in an intensive and therapeutically based program, one man was on his third partner, and there were 18 children altogether involved with that. Thank you for listening, and I hope that you would recognise, as I do, that this very probably isn't what society would want for families and for children. And if you do, if that's your wish, then I would hope that you would be able to stand up and be accounted for that. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.